Hello and welcome to the Mastermind, Body, and Spirit Show. I'm your host, Matt Belair. Today's guest is an expert on the Nomoli stones and the sacred carved figurines. Since acquiring a collection, he has investigated the history of these stones to compile information, including the connection to the Dogon. Nomoli Ben is collaborating with his college professor, Kwaku Ofori Ansa, on the first ever book and documentary specifically on Nomoli stones and where they fit. Welcome to the show, Nomoli Ben.
Thank you, Matt, for having me and us. And your circle, your viewers are in for quite a treat. I'm confident that few, if any of them, have ever heard of Nomoli, the deities, where they fit in the various theories, from ancient alien theories to how they're used tribally, or how they're perceived tribally. And I'm confident that they have not seen a collection such as we're going to show you today. So you're really opening up a door and an opportunity for them that is great. And I want to thank you on behalf of our operation too, which is our mission is to get the word out on these stones.
Yeah, well,
and to find out more.
Yeah, well, it was interesting because when you reached out, I had never heard of these things, and I started to do a little bit of research. I'm familiar with the Dogon. When I did a podcast on ancient Egypt, there were some people that were upset because of the history that the Egyptian was saying, and they were from Africa. They were saying that, actually our civilization starts in Africa, and there's some very fascinating stuff with just Africa, the history, stones, and all kinds of stuff coming out of there. So I don't know that much about it. Why don't you give us a little bit of background on yourself, how you got into this and what this is all about?
Okay, well, you said I'm an expert. I don't know if I could qualify myself as an expert, except that I'm a bit of an authority, only in that so few people know so little that I do know more than others that I've found. The way I got into it, I guess I should just start by saying I'm not as well versed or as traveled as you are in these circles. I've been in business most of my life, although I've always had an interest in the spiritual. And I had, for the last 16 years, I've been operating as an investigative reporter under the moniker of Daddy Justice. And I primarily focus on assisting those who are falsely accused. And we take on missions against individuals in government, whether they're judges, lawyers, police officers, police departments, and bring the light of day upon corruption and attempt, whenever we can, to help out innocent people who are on the bad side because of having the government jumping on their up against them and falsely accusing them. These stones come my way a long time ago. A couple of occasions there was attempts to recruit me into the intelligence community, specifically to operate in the theater of West Africa, in a relatively unfriendly territory. And but I never really got involved. Never went to Africa. I did some things here domestically, but again, continued with my businesses. But I ran into a very interesting character, became friends with him for years, and shout out to the spirit of Bill Diamond. Bill Diamonds was an American who was well versed and was able to travel the West African jungle, as very few were over many years period of time. And he was, as his name indicates, into the diamond business. And Bill was the source, and the contacts he had were the source of the items I got. I was not interested in the diamonds, but I did have interest in the spiritual items which would come out of the bush. And that's how I began to collect the Nomoli, and that's how my interest got into this. I collected them for many years, thinking that other people had collections and that they would be relatively prevalent, and not knowing very much about them, not understanding what the Nomoli gods were. Initially they sent over some wooden items and some stones. And the stones were just so powerful. Yes.
Hey, Ben, I don't mean to stop you, but there's sometimes there's like a clicking I don't know what it is. I don't know if you can help it, but there's some sort of like consistent static and clicking. And I know that if we keep diving deep, it's going to drive people nuts.
Okay.
I think it's usually, yeah. Sometimes it's the chair. I don't know. Hopefully it'll be okay. But yeah, sometimes you're fine. And sometimes there's just like this staticky clicking. So I want to make sure it's nice and clear. This is interesting stuff. It's like your friend
So my friend Bill Diamonds was the guy. He was the type of character the way back in the day when he found out the best diamonds in the world were in West Africa. He went and just got himself. He went into Freetown up into Guinea, dropped himself in the top of the bush, and would come out 6 months to 2 years later with diamonds and a lot of friends. He was just a really interesting, charismatic character in a place where very few people could get in and out alive at a time, which was very troublesome and turbulent. But he had a very interesting spirit. And he worked for the intelligence community also of the United States, which keeps track of the diamonds, movement of diamonds, because they are used for purposes of dubious individuals use them for purposes of raising funds for terrorist activities, etc. Particularly the Lebanese are active in purchasing in the bush. The long and the short of it, I had no interest in being involved in a lot of those things. I fully support our government, but I'm not, I don't feel that I'm the right guy to be involved in clandestine operations. I don't necessarily believe that we do the right thing everywhere we go in the world. But that all aside, I honor these people who are willing to go out and do those things and look out for the interest of our country. The long and short of it is I ended up being attracted to the stones, and over the years acquiring quite a collection. And a few years ago, about 5 years ago, I decided I would go out and look into what they were. And one of my family members decided they wanted to sell one of the stones. He needed some money. And so I decided to look into it, and I found that they were very rare. And that's when I found my now friend, Professor Kwaku Ofori Ansa, and Doris Dogon, Professor Kwaku Ofori Ansa, not my professor. I never made it to college. But it was the professor for 37 years of African art at Howard University. A genius, a world expert in African art, born in Ghana. And, again, went from being born in Ghana to be a professor of African art at a prestigious university. And when they saw the collection, were very excited and impressed, and asked me if we could exhibit them at the museum, which we did. Along the way, what I did is I kept attempting to find people who could tell me more about them. And what was amazing was even amongst aficionados of African art, there were very few who knew of them at all, and of the background or any of the connections. Over the period of time that they were at the museum, I spoke at the museum. We had some events, very exciting. The people who attended the museum were impressed with stones. Some people commented on the power that they had. Then thereafter, we went into, so I guess what I'd like to talk about is just briefly how they're unknown, but still they're known. Why they're still unknown and what we're finding out about them. So they're unknown in that when my son about a year ago went out, when the professor decided to write a book, and I'm working with him on that, we did an outreach to the internet and reached out to the groups that would be associated with healing stones, with ancient alien civilizations, with art, and shamans, the like, spiritual teachers and guides. And we began to ask who has experience with these stones, who can tell us that they're using them contemporaneously, because we have a few people that we have placed them with who have used them and had profound impact in their lives. And we found that not one person got back to us who had not any knowledge of these. We put them presumably in front of hundreds of thousands of people over and over again and kept asking, has anyone used these? Does anyone have any knowledge they can contribute? Because there is a scarcity of knowledge, which is why the professor decided there needs to be a book written. So they're unknown. If you were to go out into the gem show, as I did, and set up in a booth, a friend of mine's booth, and set them out front and sit there for days, the people who are very knowledgeable in gems and crystals would come by and don't feel alone. They would not know what Nomoli were. In fact, we then went to the MUFON show. we said, all right, let's go to the experts. These people have been into these things for many years. And we went to MUFON International and set up a booth, and MUFON Philadelphia over the summer. And in both instances, not one person had ever seen or heard of Nomoli stones. The only person who had ever heard of the Nomoli deities was Bill Burns. If you know, of course, Bill Burns was from the television show UFO Hunters. And he had heard of the deities, but had never seen the stones. So they're completely unknown in the modern realm, except that they are known. They were first discovered by the outside world in the 1400s by Portuguese sailors when they hit West Africa. They were first written about in 1854, Thompson on Africa, published in New York, a brief mention. They were then mentioned in publications at the turn of the century, including 1917 when Walter Edwin wrote a book of interest, 4 pages in a book of interest, again, scarcity. Then also notable is Thor Heyerdahl. Of course, you know Thor Heyerdahl. I'm sure your audience is very familiar with his travels. Okay, in 1947, or prior to that, Thor Heyerdahl was a gentleman who stated that his belief was that the Peruvians were the first ones to find and discover Polynesia and settle it. It was well known and accepted that the Asians had sailed across and had settled Polynesia, that the Peruvians were too primitive to have possibly done that. And so he set about to prove it. He was laughed out of the National Geographic magazine. He was made fun of, but someone said to him, hey, you want to prove it? Build yourself a cypress log raft and float across. So he got a team of guys together, adventurous crew for sure. And they built a raft of cypress logs exactly to the specifications as would have been done 1,500 years ago by the then Peruvians, including all how they tied it together, no modern materials, nothing. And they set about adrift off of Peru with a small sail, and 101 days later, they landed in Polynesia. The point of his overall mission, or his overall message, was that he wanted people to understand that the ancients did not see the waterways as a hindrance, but rather as a highway, as a thoroughfare. And so very, very well known in that regard. Many people, the movie was called Kon-Tiki, was the boat which he sailed across, which was named after the god. Well, Thor Heyerdahl also was the first one to do an expedition of Easter Island. And in 1957, following his expedition on Easter Island, he mentioned Nomoli stones and stated that of all the African stones, well, I should refer this to, he was referring to the very unknown small figurines which were discovered in the caves of Easter Island, which you may or may not be aware of. I don't even know if there are any more available. They've probably been absorbed into somebody's collection or museums. But he had found there were very small figurines in secret caves in Easter Island. And he noted that the Nomoli were the closest of all the African stones to those small figurines on Easter Island, and specifically the fact that they had holes in their heads. So it's written again about in 1957 by Thor Heyerdahl. Then 1990, there was a television show, Unexplained Mysteries, if I recall correctly, was the name of the show. And they mentioned the ones found by Antonio Pirelli. I took his name up here. But anyway, the gentleman who had gone over and he found the stone that was dated to 17,000 years old that had a ball bearing. When they felt it was vibrating, they did an X-ray, they found a ball bearing in it, and it was Angelo Pittoni was who it was. I want to make sure I got that right. And they took the ball bearing out and discovered that it was made of materials which certainly made and manufactured in a manner which could not have been done according to the modern beliefs 17,000 years ago. He also was the one who found what's called the blue sky stone, which was found only in Sierra Leone. It was made of, looks like plaster. It's a blue stone with white streaks. and identified with Nomoli. It was considered by the natives to be part of the sky that fell with Nomoli. In fact, he was talking to the natives, and they said that the Nomoli, which I should identify what the Nomoli are. Nomoli are the gods which lived in the heavens, according to the traditional native beliefs. And they misbehaved, mischievous. And so they were, them and their part of the heaven was turned to stone and rained down upon the earth. And then they were forced to live on earth with the humans. These stones are said to be replicas of and images of the Nomoli gods, and sometimes hybrids. They're gifts from the Nomoli gods to the humans to help, to bless them in many ways. So, where was that? Thor Hardware. Okay, so then he talked about the blue sky stones being part of the sky that fell with the Nomoli when they fell. The blue sky stones, which were only found in Sierra Leone. And they were found to be artificially somehow colored, although they are again dated to be 15,000 BC. Then again, in 2008, there is a slight mention of them in Canada or France. I have to look at that publication. But anyways, a slight mention of them. But other than that, very little mention of them. So they're unknown, but they're known. They've been recognized, and not like a new stone like the Ica stones they found and nobody had ever heard of before, and they're not sure if they really existed before. If these were real, they know they're real. So what's still unknown about them, really what's unknown about them is who, in fact, if the natives, of course, believe the gods, the Nomoli gods gave them to them, but if not, who made them? How long ago were they made? Why were they buried in the bush? Now, I guess I should mention why they're suppressed. I mean, it's not going to be a big surprise, but there are some additional factors here. I think that's worth mentioning. They're suppressed primarily for religious reasons. There's a heavy Muslimization of West Africa, and there are some Christian fundamentalists. And of course, well, I'm not judging all Christians and Muslims, but there are some factions that are more radical usually, who are not tolerant of other people's beliefs and are not at all receptive to stones and images which would be used by the tribes. So they would obviously trash them and destroy them, and it would not be seen well to be using them. This also plays over into politics, because if you want to succeed politically or in business in West Africa, your best bet is to be Muslim. And just like in my county here in Lancaster, you should be a Republican Christian if you want to succeed. And if you're not, just pretend. And, you know, so regardless, the point is that there is this, first they were buried, as Professor would point out. That's why they're suppressed. They were buried. No one knows where they came from. There's no written history of them. But then again, they're suppressed religiously. If you go politically, the same. And if you look at medically, the medical society does not want these natives using these tribal rituals scientifically. But the biggest one really is the cultural. Culturally, even many people who want to be in touch with their traditional African roots are not interested in the tribal beliefs, because there's a perception that it is uncivilized and primitive. Which one of the things these stones and other things bring about the question of is, as you mentioned before, what is the likelihood that there was a higher civilization in West Africa long ago? You know, it looks more and more like there's a possibility worth investigating into that. So there are all these reasons they've been suppressed. What have we recently uncovered? Well, you know, again, what's still unknown? Who buried them? Why they buried them? Because they're randomly found in the bush, not with grave sites often, not with temples, just randomly planted in the bush. And then what are we finding out? Well, as you mentioned briefly, we have recently made a connection to the Dogon. And along with connection to the Dogon is a potential connection to the ancient Egyptians. There are some who also believe that the Atlantean continent, of course, Edgar Casey said it was off Bimini, but many people believe it was off West Africa. So there is some consideration whether that could be the implications. The overall truth is nobody knows. But they're powerful stones, and it's our opinion from our experience that they want to be reactivated. And thus we're very interested in putting them into people's hands as we proceed, and seeing what happens. More of what we've seen already, I'm sure. So that's the basis of what Nomoli are, the stones. I could show you one just to get a general idea, since we've talked a lot about looking at one. Let me do a basic standard Nomoli. You could hold that up in front of the camera there. This would be a relatively standard female Nomoli stone. And you would see the protruding eyes, generally no, and oversized nose and lips. They said that when they wandered on the earth, that their eyes were so strong and so brilliant that you could not look at them. It was like looking into the sun. And that their voice was so powerful that when they spoke in one village, you could hear them in the next village. They were connected to crocodiles because the crocodiles and crocodiles are revered because they live on earth and in the water. So there is some connection to the water and the earth. This would be a female, fertility and abundance and health and protection. So they would be given to the individuals, and some would be used by the tribe itself, some of the larger ones. So that's a standard Nomoli stone right there.
Looks interesting. Well, one of the questions I guess would be like, how do you get it verified to be 17,000 years old? There's a lot of stuff that you said there that I can relate to in studying with a few Native American elders. Clifford Mahudi, who is a Zuni. His history is 20,000 years old. He speaks about the school system and the religions coming in systematically trying to wipe out their history, where they say it's 20,000 years old. Same with the Mayan elder that I spent time with, Carlos Barrios, and the Mi'kmaq elder, all 20,000 year histories. And it does mess with the religious history because it's considerably older. And so if there were civilizations and life and all that kind of stuff, a different history would mess up the history that we're being told. So I can see that. I'm just curious how did they date them? Do you know, like, was it the Smithsonian or is it something like that?
No, I believe that was Anthony Petoni and his, that would have been Klaus. Was Klaus involved in that? I believe Klaus, what's his last name? My memory slips the older I get old. Klaus Donna is an expert on items out of time is his specialty. And he was involved in this in 1990, and I believe the Natural History Museum of Vienna may have been involved also. It's a little sketchy to find the details online, but that's the best you can find, is that he was involved with the gentleman who found the stone and found the ball bearing in it, and with the blue strata. So my understanding is that they dated the sky blue stones and the strata around it, because of course you cannot carbon date stone. It has to be the strata in which they find it.
Well, yeah, that's interesting, because when I was with, I think it was either the Resonance Science Foundation when I was in Egypt, I was watching some presentations, and also Michael Tellinger, and they were showing these stones, and I think if you look it up, you can find it, that are sacred geometry. And they're apparently 15, 20,000 years old as well. So it's actual stone perfectly carved in sacred geometry. And you've got all of this different type of sacred geometry in these stones. And it's really fascinating and really old. And they're just like, we don't know who built that, but why. They're like, we understand this in physics now, these shapes, right? And what they were building in stone, but I don't know how they knew it then and put it into actual stone for us to find thousands of years later. So it's really fascinating if you look at the work of Michael Tellinger and the Resonance Science Foundation and what they found in ancient stone as well. So I'm curious.
Michael Tellinger was South Africa. He found all the stone circles.
Yep.
Powerful. Now he, if I'm not mistaken, was looking at dating things as far back as 100,000+ years old.
Yeah, and I've heard, the elders say that too, of all the different elders I've been speaking with. They say 20,000, but they're actually, it's hundreds of thousands. And I think that they only use 20,000 for our mind to be okay with it. It's like 10,000, 20 is like, no, it's actually hundreds of thousands. Every elder that I've spent time with has said something along those lines. It's actually hundreds of thousands. So it's really fascinating stuff, like the correlation. And I'm just curious, how do you link them to the Dogon? And can you explain to people a little bit of what you know about the Dogon tribe, who they were, what they're about? And maybe the second question would be like, what do you know about the tribe using these stones? And the last thing I'll say, actually, because I wrote it down, was that what it reminds me of is the story of the fallen angels. You have this,
Yes.
You have different stories in different cultures kind of saying the same thing. And I really find it fascinating when I do study with Native Americans and indigenous leaders that are totally separate. They don't know each other. Their stories and their histories of like myth or something is like the same, just a little bit different. Like a little bit, different person or whatever. It's like the same thing. So it's very fascinating.
Well, I know that there are new findings all the time which seem to date mankind earlier and earlier. So I'm certainly not capable of limiting how long we've been here. And I can say that we've also, what has been interesting, one way that you check out old methods is we've shown the stones to people who are sensitive and who have the ability to see and read things. And they have also dated some of them back into the 10,000 to 15,000, but others have dated civilizations they see working with the stones back 100,000 years, which is interesting. Again, I'm just reporting what I've been told by those who are. It's very interesting to see people read the stones who are sensitive, very powerful. So that was the first part, and the second part was I forgot already. Was the second part you asked?
I think it was about the Dogon. Like you just
the Dogon.
For some people don't. So what just what the Dogon are in general, and how you link the stones to them.
Yeah, what I know about a Dogon, I'm not a full expert, but I do know that they were credited with having identified the Sirius B ghost star hundreds of years ago. It's my understanding that they do a celebration along the cycle that it's an elliptical cycle, if you will. They have drawings, and they identified it long before science did. And they are of the belief that their contention is that long ago, the gods came from Sirius and landed with them and were the ones who imparted the knowledge of this Sirius B, of the star that's the third star off of them. They say there's another ghost star that has not yet been discovered, and the third planet off of that star is where they originate, and that's where mankind originated. That Ama was the god who created the Nomos, and that all mankind came out of the Nomos. So how did we connect to the Nomoli, to the Dogon? I did a show, and they were asking me about the Dogon. And again, I believe the first it was published was in the 1930s in a periodical that they had identified that these elders and the spiritual leaders, the shamans, had told them about this star. What happened was that I was on a show, and someone commented. The gentleman was asking about Dogon. He said, "Hey, the Dogon were visited by the Nomos, N-O-M-N-O-S, fish-like beings who imparted the knowledge of the universal information they gave them." And I thought, well, that's interesting, but the Nomoli are not really fish-like. But I looked it up, and the more accurate definition is amphibious. And the Nomoli are sometimes infused with crocodiles, and the powers of the crocodile are very important to them. So began to realize that, well, if they are amphibious, then what about the Nomos? Well, I looked and I found that the Dogon are from Mali. And that began to interest me because it would make sense that if you were talking about them, you would call them the Nomos of Mali. and that then could obviously be shortened over time to Nomoli. We did some research and found in 1950 there was a publication that had mentioned that they had found Nomoli 600 miles into the Dogon territory. So that was very interesting. Now this brings up the subject matter, as you brought up, about the earlier civilizations, because if there was, well, let's tie this together now. The Dogon, of course, are connected to the Egyptians genealogically. And the theory has always been, because the concept, and one of the reasons why these thoughts of West African deities have been suppressed, is that there's a general concept that outside of Egypt, there's no consciousness or light that was there. It was a dark continent, and that myth has been perpetrated pretty powerfully for a long time. So there's this image that Egypt has always been somehow a different part of the world, not even necessarily part of Africa, and that the rest of Africa is not that. But in fact, there are those who believe that, including professors and others I've spoken with, that the pyramids were not the first pyramids built in Africa and Giza. They didn't just put them there that size. They didn't just develop that technology and that knowledge all of a sudden. It had been passed on to them. And there are those in West Africa who believe that Egypt was an outpost, if you will. They migrated from West Africa to Egypt and settled there, and that the civilizations which existed long ago in West Africa have long sunk into the jungles. Where it gets interesting is that the Nomoli, of course, Nomos are the gods, and they were created by Amma, A-M-M-A. If you look at the Egyptian gods, the king of gods is Ammon, A-M-M-O-N. Both of them, the slang for both of them is Amen, which is interesting. So if you look up, now theoretically the Egyptians were first before the Dogon, but if you look it up, the Egyptians date to 3100 BC approximately, and the Dogon date to 3200 BC. It's very possible that they go the other way around. So there's the potential that there's a seed there, rather than, a seed of civilization could have existed there long ago, and that's what these stones are bringing to light.
Wow, that's fascinating. It's interesting because what I'm reminded of when I was doing a podcast with a friend of mine who's an Egyptologist that I met when I went to Egypt with the Resonant Science Foundation. And he spent his whole life, he's Egyptian. He's been studying Egypt. He's, deep on just everything. And so when I was having a podcast with the Mayan elder, he said that in Egypt, they found Mayan artifacts in Egypt. And then I've also heard this vice versa. At all these different spots, you've got these ancient cultures around the same time finding these artifacts that are they're like advanced, you know what I mean, in some way, whether it's these stones that are shaped in sacred geometry that are 18,000 years old, that are just saying, hey, like, we know this exists, and the only way you'll recognize that is through a microscope where you are scientifically to know that we know this, because we're not going to be able to give it to you in a hard drive or something. So we're going to leave it in something that you can find of the earth, and we're going to link it up in different spots. So it's really, really fascinating stuff. So what else then? So what about these stones? Like, are there more stones that are accessible? Are they continuing to be uncovered? What's the process of stones now?
It's interesting because even as far back as 1917 in the book by Walter Edwin, there's mention of the rumor that there were forgeries being made, and replicas being made even out of the country and brought in of Nomoli. So while you have something that's relatively unknown, at the same point in time, they are in the New York. There's a museum in New York that has them. In Britain, there are. In Minneapolis, I think they still have one on exhibit. So they've been exhibited around the world. They've been sold at Sotheby's for high values over the years. when they're available. As far as are they still available, there are people who would say that there haven't been any real Nomoli for a while because the market was flooded with ones that weren't authentic. I would say that the opposite is true also, that there are real Nomoli out there that could be in the possession of your viewers who have no idea what they have because they have been brought out of the country. In fact, the first writing in 1854 that's mentioned later in the book that within several years he had collected 10 Nomoli. So since the 1850s, the first, and well, the Portuguese sailors would have been traders, so they would have at least taken a couple and see if they could trade them. So they have been many taken out. But on the other hand, and I'm a collector, so I'm always a treasure hunter, so I don't want to say too much. But on the other hand, they are less and less accepted, and the Muslimization is increasing. So there are some that are available because they are being rescued from destruction, hidden and kept. So I'd say there are going to be some more available, but I don't know that there'll be many. But I again think that there's probably the British royalty has collected them for years. I believe there are probably more people in Portugal who have collected them. But I've already been contacted after just doing a couple small podcasts from people. One gentleman in Poland just yesterday sent me pictures of some stones. He wants to get my opinion on whether or not I think they are Nomoli and what I might be able to tell them about them. So I think there could be, again, people listening right now watching your show who have them that they picked up somewhere because they're connected spiritually and don't know what they are.
So in your research, did you find any like indigenous people that could explain to you, their use or why they were made or any type of history like that?
Yeah, so let me just use, let's see. It's a twin stone. Let me use the twin stone as an example. This is a very powerful stone. I don't know if you can make that out if he turns it sideways. There's two Nomoli. You'll see the Nomoli always have the very squatty legs. The more authentic or full Nomoli it is squatty legs. So that's two Nomoli, feet to feet. You'll see the big eyes, protruding eyes, of course, and they're in what would be half of a sarcophagus, maybe. So when we get the stones over the years, when they came out of the bush, they would have handwritten notes sometimes with them from the bush. And so that would be one source of information. A stone like this, we would get the information that this is called a twin stone. This would be something very attractive to your 1111 enthusiast and your twin enthusiast. This star or this stone would, by the natives, would be considered a stone that you would give to a mother who had twins, two children, in order to protect the mother and the children through their early days. Now, it would be very powerful and used for that. But then when I take that stone to Professor Kwaku Ofori Ansa, he tells me that from a broader perspective, the African art world, from what he knows more from, he's much wiser in the cultural aspects, would tell you that this is when the spiritual and the physical beings in an individual merge to become the higher self. Now, the ancient alien theorists may say that since the Nomoli were said to have turned into stone, along with their heavens where they resided, and rained down upon the earth, this could be an artist's depiction or the artistic depiction from a Nomoli of two Nomoli gods descending to earth, and then would open up, and this would be what the natives would see. So, and the answer to your question is, we might see we might get 2 or 3 different sources of information. Sometimes we won't get a lot, like this stone here. This stone here is a divining stone, and this was in diamond mining. At times, what they will do is they will divert a small stream if they feel that it's potentially diamonds underneath there. Turn it up a little bit towards the head so you can see the egg shape of the head and the eyeball shape of the head. Yeah, this way. Yeah. There you go. Yeah. Interesting character. Powerful stones. This guy was, when they diverted the stream, they dug into the base of sand and they found this stone. Thereafter, in that location, they found diamonds. In the Nomoli belief, in the tribal belief, the diamonds are part of the heavens that rain down with the Nomoli gods. They found diamonds in the location, so this stone became a divining stone, and they used it to divine for other diamond mines throughout the bush. It could be used to divine for your spirit, or divine for success in love, or anything else that you want to divine for business.
So how many of these stones have you collected over the years?
I have a few dozen, less than 50, but that's quite a few.
Yeah.
I haven't found anyone else with more than a couple, other than I understand the British royalty has a pretty decent collection. And the museums that have them usually have a couple also.
Yeah, well, what it reminds me of a little bit too is, like, I think a few years ago, there was a big find in Mexico of all these kind of like ancient alien stones and like alien heads and pipes and things like that. And I guess the Mexican people were giving them to the government at first and say, "Hey, look, we found this," and then they were just taking them. And then the people were like, "What the heck?" And so then they stopped giving them to the government. And so they started to get passed around to the people. I can't verify if those stones are legit, but I have seen a whole bunch of them, and they're very, very fascinating. And again, the information that I got was well over 10,000 years old, easily. Also looking very extraterrestrial-esque, if you will. And so I guess what I'd ask you with this researching in the stones, like what is your research concluded about what this means? Like, what do you believe? If this is, like, from your research, what do you believe about the stones? And then what does that mean?
Well, I'm a simple country boy, and I think that I'm just kind of following the trail. I didn't plan on investigating Nomoli, but I'm going to continue because it's very interesting. I would say that what's next is, of course, we're going to sell some stones and use that to write a book, and then we're going to produce a documentary. We're going to be getting them out in front of people. But I'm a simple country boy in this way. I think what's most important, what I've seen, is what happens when people get a stone in their hands when someone uses them in healings on a daily basis. So I think what really matters is how individual stones, whether they're these stones, whether they're other power stones, whether it's healing experience through any other method or the gathering of knowledge, whatever it is, it helps people out. That's the most important thing in the end. So while some may end up in museums, it's my opinion that these stones were designed and created to be used. They were handed down by some means to a very troubled world, in a difficult part of the world, and they supplied some form of relief, and they were used as tools, as blessings. And so I think what's most important is that the blessing continues, and I think, in my humble opinion, that the Nomoli spirit is, if it is indeed another powerful, positive spirit that God created, angels, fallen, but still with positive messages for the people of Earth, then they want to be activated. They want people to be blessed by them. They do not want to be dormant anymore. So I think that's the net we're looking for. The net I'm here for is I have to assume that the stones chose me. As you said, there's people who've been studying Africa, Egypt, art, all around the world. How does some guy who is really nothing special in this world in Conestoga, Pennsylvania, end up with all these stones? I have to anticipate that they chose me, and if for any reason, it is just to learn what I can from other people and pass that on, put it into book form, put it into documentary form, and then do my part in passing the blessing on which myself and those around me have received.
Wow, that's really fascinating stuff. I'm so curious. I would love to somehow, like, I know that the Dogon does exist still. Like, they still do some of their traditional ceremonies. And the way that my mind works is like, all right, we got to find an indigenous person, show them these stones, get the history, because the indigenous people that I know, they all have an oral history, and all of it's 20,000 years old. And I don't think that they're lying to me. And all of them talk about the sky people, the star people. You can look around the world and you can look at Egypt, Easter Island, friggin' Göbekli Tepe, Peru, everywhere. There's stuff that doesn't make any sense, and it's way older than 2,000 years. It breaks
Right.
that story, the story that we have been told. And I've always said it very gently, but I was recently on The Last Stand with Jay Campbell and Jeffrey Doherty, and they're just like, you know what I mean? This is the truth. Like, if you do a little research, that story is not, it doesn't hold up. You got to
Right.
look. And so what is it? It's just like another thing, these stones being unearthed. And if there is an activation potential, which before I was like, you know, in the crystals and EMF and all that stuff, and I still am. But with Michael Tellinger and things like that, he did a lot of research when he came on my podcast. It was very fascinating with a circle stone and a little
Yes.
stick. And
Okay.
saying like somehow they knew that. What I think is it's like a piece. So what I've learned about like crystals from my Native American friend David Lombard Senepas, who's a scientist, he's just like, look, he's like, yeah, crystals can do something, but not on their own. He's just like, you can't, they don't put it. He's like, this is just my opinion. He's like, I could be wrong. If you think crystals make you feel good, fine. But like, I was taught that it needs to put out an electrical charge. He's like, now if you add something to it, you can actually make it pulse. You can use the piezoelectric effect, which then opens up a whole world of science and technology and possibility. He's like,
Mm-hmm.
but I kind of equate it to be like, you find gasoline and then you worship the gasoline. It's like, no, the gasoline goes in the car and then the car moves. And so I would be curious with what these stones, like the origins, and maybe there is a possibility to turn them on, or even just, I do believe in like activation and just like information where you see something, you know, and it just shatters your worldview, because we, as we grow up, create a worldview, and sometimes we need to see it and even understand it and touch it and feel it. And then it's like, okay, it does other stuff in the mind as well. So I'd be curious to know, you know, what the potential is with these stones, their origin, and like the indigenous perspective on this. So really amazing stuff. I appreciate you sharing all this.
Well, that's interesting that you mentioned. Reminds me of Professor Rebecca Kamen, who acquired one of the stones from our collection last summer. Rebecca is a very fascinating woman. She's lived with indigenous tribes around the world for decades, in China and other places, and she lectures around the world on art, where art meets science, and the impact of indigenous tribes upon where art meets science. When she put the stone in her hands, you could tell it just lit her up. She just vibrated, and she had to acquire it. She's also a professor working with others at a variety of universities around the United States on what's called nanoparticles. And these are these very small particles that they couldn't even identify because there was no filter small enough to catch them up until recently. Specifically, she's working on neutrinos, which are believed to come from the sun, and some believe bring enlightenment to people on the earth. And nobody's quite sure what they do. I guess they're working on determining if there's a way to use them medically to heal. And of course, there will be other purposes they could be used for. She felt that her stone had something to do with that work, and something to do with her receiving of the neutrinos and the message. So yes, they could be used for activation in that regard, as you're saying, from a scientific perspective. And then that reminds me also of Jeff the Shaman. Hand me the stone right there. I had put one in the hands of Jeff the Shaman in Bradenton, Florida, the village. He's called Jeff the Village Mystic, is what he goes by in Bradenton, Florida, if you hold that up there. And a really neat guy, interesting character with some very powerful stones. There are 3 of these. I've got one. He's got another, and I'll tell you where the third one is in a minute. And when he took the stone, he put it on his altar with his crystal skull and his other extremely high-value stones. But he said that thereafter it talked to him and it told him that it wanted to be used in the healings. And so he began, and he used it in healing after healing for months. In fact, then he had a client who he called a highly evolved woman who decided that she wanted to acquire the third piece in the set. And I have agreed to hold on to the first piece for purposes of triangulating between the three of us. But this is, again, a very powerful piece. And that's the interesting thing. Now, Jeff said he believed at one time that there were beings helping him do those healings that were manifesting because of and through the stone. So this is, I think that's what really matters when it comes down to it. It's all the other things are great to discuss and to know and to explore. But what does it do for people that are suffering is what matters.
Yeah, super, super interesting. The other thing that I kind of makes me think about is, you know, the Native Americans and like what I've learned from spending time with them and doing different things. Some of them are weird, but a lot of it is just getting out into nature. Really, it's like, it seems weird, but it's not. It's just like, get the hell outside. So, but in that view, it's like when you talk to spirit and you understand spirit, everything is alive. So even if I'm, you know, one of the assignments that I had is training, you know, Shokai, this ancient martial art, and I got to go get a staff. I can't go buy a staff. I actually got to go in the forest and get one and give like a thank you in my own way to the tree that I cut down, because everything is living. So if you create that and that stone is living in some capacity, it just sparks curiosity about what's possible. And then I really like to, look at like bridging the gap of like science and understanding and saying, okay, look, like what do we know from the indigenous? What do we know in the scientific world of neutrinos? What can we prove? And what are the, what are the effects that are having? It's very interesting stuff. But even the grounded part of just having more of these type of artifacts come in the mainstream that say, hey, look, these are dated 18,000 years old. Who knows about them? What is that history? What happened then? Because in looking up the Dogon and those tribes, they talk about like, you were pretty versed in that. And that was a little bit more than I knew, but it was like kind of the fish-like people. And, one of the stories I heard was it came down on a ship and then made this little pond, and they jumped out of the ship and they started to talk to the people, and they're like, oh my God. And then they got back in the ship and peaced out. But it's interesting because it's in their art. You know what I mean? And it's in their history, and they keep that story going down. And for the people that I've spoken to that hold those lineages, it's not anything special to them. It's just what it is. It's just what they were taught. Just like if you were taught anything like, a small town USA guy that liked football or whatever, you know what I mean? And this is the way life is. Like, that's what it is for them. It's just like, that's just the way life is, man. Like, these things came down and jumped out the spaceship, and here's the proof. But we can date that 18,000 years old. So they have actual artifacts that are corroborating their stories. And I'm excited to have more of that information out there to discover what the actual truth is about ancient civilizations, histories, and things like that. And I think stones like this are an important part for us to begin looking at and exploring and trying to uncover, how far back they go, what's the truth, and who are the wisdom keepers that will have more information on something like that.
Well, this is something that you remind me of is Angelo Petroni again. When he was out in the bush, he was talking to the shamans, and I don't think I said this before, but he said to them, well, if it says that the Nomoli rained down and they came down and their entire sky turned to stone. So if the sky turned to stone, it must have rained down also. And the shaman said, yes, of course. And he said, and we know where it is. And that's when he took him to the blue sky stone. And they said, this is where the sky rained down. When he dug down under the strata, this is what's interesting with the connection to the Egyptians. He purportedly found a large structure of the blue sky stones formed into the shape of a pyramid that they dated to 15,000 BC, which is, of course, considerably older than the Egyptian pyramids. So that was of interest. As you said, and a native said, well, of course we know where the sky fell. It fell over here. And there was another statement where one of the natives was talking to a scientist, and the scientist, well, who carved these? And the native was just looking at him like, well, you just are spiritually completely ignorant. I told you, God gave them to us. Nobody around here knows how to carve these. He said, what part of that don't you understand? And so, yeah, to them, it's just, this is the way it is. These guys came long ago. They imparted this knowledge. They tried to help them out. They taught them values of how to treat each other. Some of the Nomoli aren't of looking at all. There are some which are, as I mentioned, one, some I should mention here that are infused, as you see this one here. This one is infused with a crocodile. We talked about that one. Some are a combination of human, hybrid, and Nomoli. So the theory is that they were imparting upon the humans their assets that they carried with them from the otherworldly location it came from. But what we found, and what I have some of, which are very unusual, is some of the ones which are consistent with stones from other parts of the world. Go ahead, set that one over there. Because they have the elongated heads, that we would call these more along the lines of the ancient alien. They're not consistent necessarily with Nomoli gods as much as they are with elongated heads. This one almost has a helmet on, if you can see. Hold them up close and show them back a little further. And let's see. Something like that.
Well, the elongated head is an interesting one, because when I went down to Guatemala for the Mayan Heart Festival, I did a tour. It's the ATM tour. If you look that up in Belize, it's a strange name, but you go into this cave and you see a skull that looks like your typical gray alien. And I did speak with Carlos Barrios, because it's like, that looks like an ET to me, bro. He's like, yes, I know, but we did have the ability to do skull manipulation. So, it could be human. I don't know, but it was very, very weird looking. And there are elongated skulls, and there have been for Hugh Newman was on my podcast, and he did a lot of research on giants and these elongated skulls, and those ones for sure are definitely not modified. They're massive. And one of the things that he told me, I was like, well, how do you know today that like this is for real? He's like, well, I forget what the group was, which I friggin' should know if I'm talking about it, but it's like a group of explorers in like the 40s, 30s, 1800s, things like that. They wrote it down. They had to write it down, and you can actually go find the logs and the photos, and there's sketches and logs with people's signatures saying, look, this thing, we measured it out 12 feet, the skull like this, we don't know what it is. And so that he's like, I had to go dig those things out to figure out if it was legit. And he's like, it's written and signed in these, it's like some explorers club. So
amazing. Here's another example of an elongated head. This would be a chief stone. So the chiefs, of course, the stones are called Nomoli, they're called Pondo, they're also called Mahayate, which means chief spirit, Mahanyate. And so that the chiefs would theoretically be infused with the values that you would want them to have, that the Nomoli espouse, such as wisdom, justice, bravery, fairness, big heart, and the ability to be prosperous. So the connection to the gods was perceived, of course, as the ability to prosper for the entire tribe and nation, chiefdom.
Amazing. Well, Ben, thanks so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate this. This is really interesting stuff. Is there anything else that you want to share that we didn't cover that you want to talk about before we close it up?
Well, I suggest everyone can look at ancientalienstones.com and watch the video of the professor and Doris Dogon talking about the stones. It's a great little 15-minute video if you want to look at the stones on your own, and there are quite a few stones exhibited there. I'd also encourage anyone, and I should answer too under your Dogon thing about my contemporaneous Dogon. If there are others who would want to be involved in the process of getting the word out and being part of this adventure, they certainly are welcome. And we encourage everyone out there to just let other people know, pass this podcast on. You guarantee that if you send it to anybody you know, they're going to see something that they haven't seen before. Even if it's just, I don't think they'll see much or any of it. They won't know of it. And how cool is it to have something different? It's great to have the Stonehenges and all those and have another person's opinion on them. But how often do you find something absolutely different, or a treasure, or find? And I want to also say that it means that Matthew, that there are probably likely other great finds out there for anybody. I mean, not necessarily has to be the adventurers trekking through the pyramids. There are adventures out there. There are finds. There are treasures out there. The spiritual healing power tools. I believe that God has put them out there in many forms, any form He wants. He doesn't check with me first. So, yeah, they're there, and I'm just grateful to be part of the process. It's a gift and a responsibility when you find something exciting and new, and you want to share it with other people, and then you recognize how few people know about it. It's been a challenge also. So thank you for your assistance in that mission.
Yeah, well, thank you so much.
Thank my son Quinn for his help. Without him, I would
Thanks,
know
Quinn.
nothing.
It was great modeling. There was a perfect rotation, nice speed. It was fantastic.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, really, it's really incredible stuff. Like all the best in the documentary and in the book. And, as I kind of move through, I'm sure like some people that I have in the podcast world, like this is what it's for. It's for exploring and trying to figure out real history, what is going on and how, like, what's the truth. And so, it's stuff like this is really just eye opening. Where did these come from? What's the history? And there's little known about the Dogon as well. And even the Native Americans, like, with David Lombear, who I've been kind of studying with the last 2 years, he's like, I've only been here for 5 years sharing this knowledge. We never told you. When I was down with the Mayan elder, he's like, you people don't know this. He's like, you came and conquered us. You never asked us a question. You tried to wipe us. You tried to wipe us out. You know what I mean? He's like, you didn't ask us for any information. He's just like, only some of us are trying to tell you, and it pisses some of the indigenous people off because they're like, screw them. You know what I mean? Don't tell them this stuff. Like they came here and did this.
Right.
They don't deserve this knowledge. So you have like a little bit of a war there. And Clifford kind of talked about that, sharing some of the stuff with the Hopi, being upset with them sharing some of their sacred knowledge. So it's a very fascinating thing. And I'm hopeful that more indigenous cultures and some of the stuff like the Dogon and things like that, we're going to get those real stories coming out from these real leaders and stuff like that. Stuff like this that makes you want to go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, I have been contacted by one Dogon contemporarily, lives in Africa, who does use the stones. Told me some information with some numbers. I wasn't quite fully understanding it, quite frankly. But the key was that they mentioned that these were gifted to individuals. They were gifts of the spirit, and they came with them with blessings, and that they would be utilized throughout the lifetime often by the same person who would have been given the gift, and that they are used by the Dogon, but that they are, according to the elders, I was told, that they have to open the doors for anyone who approaches and asks to be in the circle with positive intentions. So they welcome any and all to find these stones and to utilize them.
That's amazing. Holy crap. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. And I'm so stoked for the documentary. I'll definitely throw things at if people come through and have some information, I'll let you know. And if you make any breakthroughs, keep me in the loop.
More will be revealed.
Cool. All right. Well, have an amazing day.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thanks everybody for watching. Peace.